Good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name's Siân Bradley. I'm a Senior Research Fellow here at Chatham House, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this special COP26 event, co-hosted with the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative and held on Energy Action Day. We have interference on the line there, so yeah, we'll just have to mute. Now, as many of you know, there has been an increasing focus on fossil fuel supply at this COP and on the impacts of transition on developing countries with extractives and on the much broader topic of a just transition. And of course, none of these challenges can be effectively managed without transparency and public engagements around the extractive sectors. So it's a really, really important topic that we're discussing today. And as the global standard for transparency in the extractive industries, EITI is obviously crucial to advancing it. And we have an exceptional panel to take us through the issues today, headed up by the Right Honourable Helen Clark, who is chair of the EITI board, and then followed by Dr. Syahrial, the Secretary General at the Ministry of Energy in Indonesia, Brendan Devlin, Strategy and Foresight Counsellor in the Directorate General for Energy of the European Commission, Rohitesh Dhawan, CEO of the International Council on Mining and Metals, ICMM, and then Nelly Busingye, the Member Engagement Manager for Africa for Publish What You Pay. So we'll start with opening remarks from Helen and our country speaker, and then we'll hear from our expert discussants before opening up the conversation. And we really do want this to be a conversation. So please submit your comments and questions throughout. As most of you will know by now, you can submit these using the chat function on the right-hand side of the platform. And you can do that throughout the session. You don't have to wait for the Q&A. This session is being translated into French and Spanish. You can select language via the small globe icon at the bottom of the screen. And finally, I should flag that obviously this session is on the record, it's being recorded, and it will be available alongside others on Conference Plus on demand after today. So with that said, it's my pleasure to welcome Helen Clark, Chair of the EITI board, and also I should say as of July, President of Chatham House. Now Helen needs very little introduction, and it's under her leadership that EITI has really begun to engage with the issue of climate risk and energy transition by listening to country and civil society calls for engagement and by launching a policy and research process, which Chatham House was privileged to lead on, and by taking this issue to the board level and committing to action. And there's been fantastic practical work on this agenda since by EITI and by a whole host of partners, including NRGI, Carbon Tracker, and many others. So we're all really excited to hear about EITI's progress and of course EITI's plans looking ahead. So with that, Helen, over to you. So we have lost Helen for a moment. I think there are issues with the link. So what we will do is go back to front and we'll bring in Dr. Syahrial first, who is our country representative, Secretary General in the Ministry of Energy in Indonesia. And perhaps we can do this the other way around and begin with a country perspective. And then we'll loop back to Helen and hear about how EITI has been responding to these challenges. No, Helen's back, averted.
Siân, I'm back. Unfortunately, I've been sent faulty links, but
we were just about to redo the order, but Helen, you're back just in time. So
no worries.
The floor is yours.
Yep. Sorry, everyone, but greetings and truly thank you to everyone from around the world who's joining this COP26 event. At EITI, we really welcome the focus on producer countries at this COP and on what the transition to net zero will mean for their economies and societies. And the implications of that are what EITI seeks to shine a light on in its contribution to addressing the energy transition. So let me set out briefly how we think we can help do that. As I think you've said, Siân, in introducing me, the EITI sets the global standard for open and accountable and transparent management of oil, gas, and mineral resources. We have the EITI standard, which is implemented by 56 resource-rich countries, and their populations, of course, have expectations that those resources will deliver for them for sustainable development. All of our member countries are affected in one or more ways or another by the energy transition. And so the need for EITI to understand better what its role could be in this space is what led to the collaboration with Chatham House and its research and dialogue capacity. That led to the research paper developed for us titled Transparency in Transition. It had key recommendations. We then took those to our board, and the board decided to take them forward and reflect the transition in the EITI's work. We've also collaborated closely with other key partners, in particular the Natural Resource Governance Institute, NRGI, in identifying opportunities to support resource-dependent countries as they prepare for the energy transition. So what can we do? Firstly, our contribution is through the data and disclosures which the EITI's processes generate. And that information should enable decision makers and key stakeholders to have informed debates on what the implications of the energy transition are for their countries. The kinds of issues that can be addressed include the following. How will future revenues and investment related to extractives be affected by the transition? And let's note here, of course, that the impacts will differ a lot between the producers of fossil fuels on the one hand and those of the strategic minerals needed for sustainable energy on the other. Then there's the need to understand assumptions made in revenue forecasts, both from fossil fuels and from critical minerals. This is very important in assessing how future revenue flows could be impacted. There's the question of the scale of national public finance invested in fossil fuels, which is potentially at risk under more rapid, even disruptive transition scenarios. And that is of great relevance to the macroeconomic stability of producer countries. In fact, you could go further and say that if the macroeconomic stability is greatly impacted, it will have other stability implications as well. So our data and disclosures can help shed a light on these issues, and it will be necessary to be able to have a complete picture of a state's investment in extractives, including through its state-owned enterprises, which have a tendency often to be somewhat opaque. Then we need to understand the scale of fossil fuel subsidies in a country in order to assess the impact that may be having on clean energy investment. The EITI standard enables disclosures and analysis that can inform debate around revenue resilience. The transition will also require adapting legal frameworks and contracts to the new realities and making sure that risks of future commodity price fluctuations are shared by all parties to a contract. Using publicly accessible contracts, civil society actors such as NRGI are analysing contracts and identifying clauses in them that could pose risks to governments as the transition to net zero speeds up, as well as the important question of how local communities, subnational revenues, and local jobs are affected by the energy transition. Reporting and analysis of current and future subnational transfers and payments from extractives can help communities and local governments anticipate revenue fluctuations. So overall, EITI is in a position to help ensure that there's reliable and timely information available to governments and citizens so that they can respond to these kinds of questions that I've been setting out. So these are some of the ways that we can help. A second area of EITI contribution. Our processes are about inclusive platforms for dialogue between governments, industry, and civil society. And these need to be applied to dialogue on the energy transition. To identify smart and sustainable solutions to the climate crisis, a diversity of views and experiences need to come into the policy debates. The quest for climate justice in all its forms is rising on the agenda of the COP this year. It's critical, for example, that the voices of younger people are heard on the extractive sectors and what constitutes responsible governance of them. We think our multi-stakeholder platform can also help facilitate coordination across agencies in a country, across the ministries of finance, energy, petroleum, mines, climate, environment. Most of these are already represented in EITI multi-stakeholder groups in country, and they need to be coordinated to ensure alignment in developing energy transition policies. A multi-stakeholder approach, such as what we offer, is also important for ensuring that citizens are included through open dialogue and consultation and not locked out of decision making. The research paper which Chatham House prepared for EITI set out how some countries are already using EITI data and dialogue processes to explore issues around the energy transition. For example, Germany's engagement on the coal phase-out, Indonesia's engagement around energy transition planning, and Trinidad and Tobago's efforts to build emissions reporting into their EITI processes. As these activities develop, EITI could help contribute to the inclusion of the extractive sector within nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, under the Paris Agreement. So, in summary, we stand ready to support implementing countries of the EITI standard to advance their country-level analysis on the economic implications of the transition, and to support building the capacity of stakeholders to engage in informed debate on the associated risks and opportunities. And we can also consider how the efforts being made by implementing countries should be reflected in future iterations and revisions of EITI's standard. So I really look forward to hearing from our esteemed speakers and discussants today on how they are perceiving the issues I've been alluding to. Back to you, Siân.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Helen, for that update and for that quite exciting overview of where next. And I think it's an incredible achievement in the space of 18 months or 2 years, and in the context of the global pandemic, which has placed producer countries under unprecedented pressure to advance such a clear set of questions that are emerging for EITI's implementing countries, and to begin really showing how EITI data and dialogues can help shed light on some of these questions. So that is perhaps a really good segue into our next speaker, Dr. Syahrial, because Indonesia, of course, as one of the world's largest coal exporter, a significant oil and gas producer, a minerals producer with copper, gold, nickel, among other exports, is significantly exposed to the transition. And as Helen mentioned, Indonesia already has an EITI multi-stakeholder group that is very engaged with the issue of energy transition. And so I wondered, Dr. Syahrial, from the Ministry of Energy's perspective, what are the greatest challenges and opportunities that Indonesia is facing in preparing for transition? And how is the government currently addressing these risks? Dr. Syahrial, over to you.
Thank you, Siân, distinguished speakers, participants, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me, Siân?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Okay, good morning. It is great a pleasure for me to take part in this EITI webinar, Transparency in Transition. First of all, I would like to convey my minister's apology that he cannot attend for this webinar, because he at the same time have to attend the plenary on the declaration of phasing out coal for the power plant. So please allow me to read his speech regarding about the Indonesian's transparency in transition. So as part of the largest agricultural country, one of the vulnerable areas to the climate change impact, Indonesia has a strong commitment to tackling the climate change. Our President, Joko Widodo, has stated in several occasions, as well as in this week COP's meeting, regarding Indonesia commitment in pursuing green and clean technology for industry as a means to achieve sustainable growth. In principle, our effort toward net zero emission follows 5 points, which are the acceleration of renewable energy development, reduction of fossil-based energy, increasing the use of electric vehicles in transportation sectors, the use of electric home appliances for household and industry sector, and the utilization of clean technologies such as carbon capture and storage. According to our national determined constitution, the government of Indonesia has committed to reduce greenhouse gas emission by 29% with our national self-effort, or 41% with international assistance by 2030. By national self-effort, total emission reduction from our energy sector is targeted of around 300 million ton carbon dioxide equivalent by 2030. The reduction is coming from several mitigation programs such as the renewable energy development, energy efficiency, and post-mining reclamation. As collaborative action, global energy landscape is currently transitioning to a low carbon economy and a climate neutral world. In this context, Indonesia has prepared an energy transition roadmap to a carbon neutral for the period 2021 to 2060. It will reduce portion of fossil fuel extractive industry product. Therefore, there are main strategies that include, first is massive development of new and renewable energy. We are focusing on solar, hydro, and geothermal energy resources, while at the same time also considering the utilization of hydrogen. Reduction of fossil energy utilization through gradual retirement of coal power plants, conversion of diesel power plant into gas and renewable energy, and also no additional new coal power plant unless it is already agreed on previous contract or under construction stage. With regard to the early retirement of coal power plant, Indonesia has prepared an energy transition mechanism scheme with resource of financing include, among others, multilateral banks, including concession loan, blended finance for the stimulus of renewable energy incentive, private sector, institutional investor, domestic and international, and long-term investor with low fees and interest. Development of supergrid connecting islands around the country to ensure every new and renewable energy resources are well connected and utilized. As one of the major extractive industry country, Indonesia has to anticipate the risks and the challenges in facing from energy transition. Transition to less carbon economy will potentially reduce or even stop extractive industry activities. Extractive industry need to be diversified into more sustainable way and support mining material base for energy transition. Economic transformation in surrounding extractive industry areas required to stabilize the country's economy. It is potentially bringing an opportunity loss from extractive industry investment and competitiveness. To maintain contribution of extractive industry to national economy, job creation, and community development will decrease. Need to preparing extractive business diversification into more sustainable energy supply and producing basic material for energy transition support, such as clean coal, processed product, rare earth element, and battery. In this regard, key items to be managed are disclosure and communication of transformation steps and processes and preparation of extractive business diversification. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, effective engagement is the key to success toward low carbon energy transition. It is my sincere wish that through this forum, we can discuss the potential for forthcoming collaboration and step up our effort to keep the extractive industry will continue contributing economic development and supporting energy transition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Syahrial. Really, really good points there on, I think, the huge challenges that Indonesia faces, but also on the importance of international collaboration. And you mentioned the energy transition mechanism, which was launched here at COP yesterday with the aim of accelerating coal phase out. And of course, it would be great to come back to in the discussion how EITI data and dialogue can really help Indonesia's transition. So we'll loop back to you on that in a moment. But in the meantime, I want to move the conversation on to our discussants. And let's kick off with Brendan. Brendan, you've been working as an advisor to the European Commission on energy issues for many, many years now. Can you share with us, I guess, some thoughts on how the EU is thinking about the transition to net zero and what the likely impacts might be for fossil fuel exporting countries in terms of demand and pressure on life cycle emissions and other factors that are beginning to become part of the conversation at the EU level? Brendan.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I mean, as you all will know, the European Union is the current largest purchaser of hydrocarbons globally. We are by far the largest purchaser of, for example, fossil gas, which crosses borders. And we are likely to be a very large purchaser of the minerals for the transition in the future as well. And the other thing to bear in mind about the European Union is that we are an ethical actor. Not always, of course, you can't always be ethical, and in practice, things turn out wrong. But we go in with good intentions, and we want to see a responsible management of the just transition for the future. And I think that is something that we will operationalize over the next few years. On the other side, from us as consumers, we see producers and suppliers of raw materials to the European Union. One of the points that I would hold in contrast to what Helen said is that we are starting to talk about producers or asset holders or hydrocarbon reserves in a completely different way than we had in the past. We have to start thinking that hydrocarbon reserves are not reserves. An asset is not an asset if you cannot use it. And we know that the IEA and other responsible organizations are already arguing for hydrocarbons to remain in the ground. And that is going to have systemic effects all the way through both financial and energy systems. An asset which cannot be realized can't be used as security for loans. It can't be used in the way that it has been in the past. If you look at the disclosure data that you see in, for example, the United States in the SEC disclosure procedures, you can still classify an asset for up to 10, 15, 20 years in front of you as something that you will develop and against which you can lend money. But that is no longer true if there is going to be a secular reduction of hydrocarbon demand over the next 10, 15 years. So we have to start thinking in a more systematic way about these things. I would like to point to 3 signals that the European Union is sending at this COP this year about what its future intentions are. The first one is perhaps something that has escaped a lot of people, is what I would call the Arctic signal. The first time the European Commission has published a paper calling not for the development of resources, but for keeping resources in the ground. All resources in the Arctic region, from hydrocarbons perspective, should be kept in the ground. And we have received a political instruction to work towards that end. Not only have we been asked to keep those resources in the ground, we have a complementary signal, which is that we should not buy those resources if somebody else develops them. And I think that is something that has changed considerably over the course of Siân, you were very kind in saying I've been here some time. I've been here too long, I think, perhaps, because I can remember when we used to build pipelines, support pipelines to new resources. Now we are actively keeping those resources in the ground and making a promise not to buy any reserves or hydrocarbons that are produced in conflict with the IEA 1.5 degree C pathway till 2050. So that's the first signal. The second signal is the methane policy, and in particular, the Global Methane Pledge, which sets out a vision for collective responsibility for cleaning up hydrocarbons between producers and consumers. Instead of making it the responsibility of producers to clean up, we have said it is our responsibility as consumers. And in the period post-2025, 2030, when we start to decline in our consumption of oil and gas, we will have the freedom to choose which producers we take resources from. And the signal that comes from the methane strategy is that we will be choosing the cleanest. And my last point is the data signal. We have set up last week the International Methane Emissions Observatory to help us with the Global Methane Pledge. We very much hope that the EITI will develop a role in the systemic change coming from the classification of assets in the international financial system and how that affects developing and producing countries. But we also think that it's necessary to start consolidating all of the information that we have so that we have a global registry of hydrocarbon resources to make choices for the future. Siân.
Thank you, Brendan. And we can come back to all of these points in discussion. They're really important points. And I think the strength of the signals coming from the EU on this in terms of the future demand trajectory and life cycle emissions is incredibly clear, and it raises the issue of whether the data and the disclosures and the dialogue at country level is currently comprehensive and strong enough to support that and give countries a voice and engage producer countries in that discussion. This is obviously the picture for fossil fuel producers, but there is also the question of the minerals and metals that will be required for transition. And so I want to bring in Rohitesh Dhawan here. He is CEO of the ICMM and took the helm back in April at a really interesting time in terms of rising expectations around mineral demand scenarios. And of course, rapidly growing pressure on mining companies from their investors and consumers to address emissions. So Rohitesh, I wonder if you can give us a few thoughts on how you see this playing out for producer countries and where you think the greatest need for transparency and better data is.
Siân, thank you. Let me start with just a full-throated support for EITI, its aims, its objectives. ICMM has been proud to be a supporter of EITI for well over a decade, and all of our 28 member companies are supporters of EITI. And for anybody who hasn't come across ICMM, the International Council on Mining and Metals, it's a collection of 28 of the world's largest mining companies, together accounting for about a third of the global industry across 650 sites in over 50 countries. So everything I say is going to be from that perspective of the industry. Now, Siân, you asked about what role we can play in supporting producer countries with transparency and transition. And let me say there are just three key things that I believe we can make a contribution through. The first is making very clear commitments about our own decarbonization commitments and trajectories. And in that regard, just over a month ago, we committed as the ICMM to achieve net zero scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 or sooner, in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So unequivocally, the sector is committed to decarbonizing its own operations, which represents, I think, an ambitious commitment from a hard to abate sector. And it's a little curious, Siân, that some countries around the world have used the mining sector as a pretext for not taking faster action on climate change. What I hope our commitment does is send a very clear signal that we as the industry certainly are very serious about decarbonizing our own operations. And just in case anybody feels, well, that's all well and good for a bunch of large mining companies, the membership we have spans, yes, the world's largest miners, of course, but also state-owned enterprises and all the way down to single asset, single company entities. So we're very conscious that there will be different people at different stages of this journey, depending on size and commodity portfolio, but ultimately we're all shooting for the same goal, which is net zero 2050 or sooner. So the first thing, Siân, is the commitment we can make as the industry. The second is on disclosure, and this gets to the heart of your question. And so not only are we saying we will achieve net zero scope 1 and 2, but the commitment has a set of very important aspects related to disclosure. The first is for every company to report in line with the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD. So every company will be doing that by 2023 if they aren't already. The second is to have full disclosure of the assumptions and methodology used in building decarbonization trajectories at a company level. All too often, the devil is indeed in that detail, and we think it's incredibly important for those assumptions and methodology to be entirely transparent, and that's what we will do. The third is where any company uses relative or intensity-based emission targets to very clearly show what those mean for absolute emissions. Helen talked about supporting NDCs. NDCs require real clarity on the impact on absolute emissions. And finally, to report performance every year on scopes 1, 2, and 3, which are externally verified, once again providing critical data to national authorities to set NDCs. So Siân, that's the second way that we think we ought to and are supporting countries in the transition, which is on disclosure. And finally, the third way is on taking action that supports the decarbonization at a national level. And here I'll just very quickly signpost one example, which we can come back to, which is the work, for example, of Anglo American in South Africa, using water pumped from mine sites into storage facilities using renewable energy, providing a low-cost solution for energy storage that goes well above and beyond decarbonizing our own operations. Lots of other potential like that in land use and energy, which we can come back to. Siân, back to you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Rohitesh. So a clear commitment to decarbonisation there, and we can come back to scope 3 and life cycle emissions and market access in discussion, but a clear commitment to decarbonising operations, disclosures, and rethinking partnerships in support of country climate commitments and sustainable development. We're looking at the clock, and I want to make sure that we get time to take in this round of questions, but we'll turn quickly to Nelly Busingye, Publish What You Pay's Member Engagement Manager for Africa. Now, Nelly, you work with civil society, you're close to the local socio-economic impacts of the extractive industries. And so I wonder if you could introduce for us your thoughts on how you see these impacts changing through transition, and how better data and dialogue can help support strong civil society engagement in a just transition. Nelly, over to you.
Thank you, Siân. I think, thank you for the opportunity to feed into this discussion. I think it's very important. The transition is moving quite fast, I guess, in so many ways. I think part of this discussion, I feel, should also consider, those that are hosts to the resource, those that are at the community level, the national level, those that actually bear the brunt of the impacts of some of the climate change related impacts around this issue. However, also, because I think we need to also recognize that some of these communities that host the resource, I'm privileged to work with civil society organizations, as you mentioned, that are working with so many communities that host different extractive projects. And one of the challenges we face also is that because there is a lot of anticipation from projects of this nature, the revenues that are expected out of this resource, these resources, and the fact that so many of our countries, especially in the global south, in Africa, where I'm based in Kampala as well, are anticipating better jobs, better lives. Many of the communities that we're talking about have given out their land to host the resource in anticipation of better jobs, better business opportunities. And so when we're talking about the transition, we really need to put that into consideration, because we're saying that we're going to cut demand for fossil fuels, but also you have to recognize that this is what many of these communities are anticipating because of the extraction of these resources for better lives and better opportunities. And so sometimes you want to think that the energy transition probably makes more sense for economies that have already thrived, after extracting and benefiting from the extraction of these fossil fuels for centuries. And so that doesn't put into consideration those that actually now new producers, those that are anticipating better opportunities from this resource. And so when we're talking about EITI and disclosure and the discourse around this issue, it's really to put into consideration what that information and what the disclosure of information really means for those that are at the last, the communities at the local level and the like. And so as civil society, most times we're caught in between there, trying to speak to those that really don't know what this transition really means, and we talk about it here because it's coming, it's there, it's moving really fast. But what does it mean for someone who has given away part of their property or their land to make way for a project, a project that, that they have been told revenues are coming. Governments are borrowing in anticipation of revenues that are coming. And this is very, very prominent in Africa, where many of our civil society and the groups that we're talking about are best. And so I think when we're talking about EITI, especially for countries that are EITI countries and those who are intending to join EITI countries, I think there needs to be a focus on really making sure that this debate is becoming more prominent at the in many of our countries and on the multi-stakeholder groups. And then you also find that as civil society organizations, it's very important their capacity and their level of the information that they receive and they're able to get can actually influence decisions around energy transition and what it means for the future. And of course, also the civil society organizations that are represented in many of the multi-stakeholder groups, but the ones that are not necessarily in multi-stakeholder groups, but are convening issues around EITI, need to be engaging, and their capacity really needs to be built to be able to understand and really feed into these processes, but also how the EITI information is more meaningful in the future. Because I think the standard, as we begin to discuss the revisions around the standard, they really need to address some of these issues, but I think that information needs to be very clear. And I think demystified also, because beyond the MSGs, we're talking about those at the very least, at the very local and grassroots level that feel the impact from many of these projects across Africa. I mean, you look at what's happening, in Uganda, where I'm based, there is a pipeline coming up. There is a lot of anticipation with what that pipeline is going to do across Uganda and Tanzania. And you know what that really means for the future. But are we talking about energy transition per se? Maybe not so much within the MSGs. You look at other countries, even those that may not necessarily but the EITI, but are anticipating to join EITI, like Kenya. The communities as well, are they really privy to some of these changes that are coming? So I think it's really, really important that as we talk about as we talk about these issues, and as we recognize that the transition is coming, we don't forget those that have sacrificed already, that have made sacrifices and decisions based on the future, and that is recognized and it's catered for as this transition. So it's really important that it's just and fair as we go ahead. I think I'll stop there for now, Sean. Sorry.
Nelly, thank you so much. And yeah, I'm sorry that we don't have more time to expand these comments out, because these are really, really important points that you're raising. And I think that they relate very well to what Brendan was talking about in terms of rethinking the value of extractive resources. And of course, investors are doing this from an international level, but at the community level, it's really, really important that these discussions are well informed, well evidenced, and that there is active engagement, because, as you say, where there's a trade-off implied and expectations around returns from the sector and a risk of that not materializing, that will lead to significant challenges. So really, really important points there. We have about 10-15 minutes left. So I want to open up the discussion. We have a handful of questions that have already come in, and I'll do my best to convey them to the panel. And maybe we can kick off with the question from Caroline Avan about the need for most fossil fuel resources to stay in the ground, and the question of whether EITI will update companies' expectations and ask for support for additional disclosures on fossil fuel phase out and related transition plans with project level information. And this is, of course, something that we dipped into in the research process, thinking about what EITI data and disclosures and dialogue look like through the management of the transition and the phase out of oil and gas production and coal production in different contexts. And related to this, there's a question from Simon Taylor about the issue of pace, and particularly how quickly an organisation like EITI can move. And of course, we're hearing and feeling this week very strongly the urgency of action. So I wonder on these 2 points about how EITI will update company expectations and what it will ask companies for, and on the issue of pace of work on the agenda. If I can come back to you, Helen, on those questions, and then of course other panelists, please come in if you have thoughts and remarks on those. Helen.
Well, thanks for the questions. And I guess the short answer is the EITI can move as fast as it can broker a consensus across its multi-stakeholder platform. We are currently looking at companies' expectations paper and principles, and it is possible to envisage that industry could be pushed more to demonstrate leadership and support government efforts to prepare for transition and be more transparent about its own planning. I think it's important to note that when EITI set up, it was before there was any really major discussion about energy transition, and the focus was very much on getting transparency around the revenue flows from the extraction of resources. And now we're with my full support and full support of a new executive secretary for the organisation, we're really looking at advising countries on how to transition from these resources, meaning, as Brendan said earlier, you wouldn't be getting any money from them at all because there are resources that will become stranded assets and resources that simply need to stay in the ground or under the seabed or whatever. So this is quite a major shift to effect in an organisation, and not an easy one, and not easy questions for example, implementing countries, which are mainly developing countries, many of whom are late entrants to resource extraction, and had seen what looked like a flow of revenues into the future, and are now seeing that that won't be the case at all. So when we talk about just transition, we're often thinking of local communities or particular sectors of employment in a country. But let's think bigger. There needs to be a just transition too for developing countries, which have resources which have become stranded assets. And I hope that our friends in the donor community will be also applying their minds to what support, catalytic support, might go to country X, Y, or Z, who no longer can expect to have flows of revenues coming through, which might have come if they'd been exploiting them 30, 40, 50 years before. So there's some quite profound issues in here. And it's a mind shift for EITI, and not necessarily an easy conversation at the table, not necessarily easy with some companies, and not necessarily easy with some developing countries, which have put a big stake in the ground on fossil fuel extraction.
They're really good points, Helen, and I think often when we talk about a just transition, people conflate the concept of a just transition within countries and how you manage the distributional impacts of phase out, and then of course a just transition between countries, which is where your comments just there land. And of course there is a big push at COP26 for wealthier countries to take the lead on this, with initiatives like the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance being launched next week, and a big push on climate finance and support for alternative development pathways for developing countries with extractive resources. And these needs sort of come together to support this discussion at the level of the EITI implementing countries. I wonder if we could sort of move on from there and dig in a little bit more to what this conversation looks like at the country level. And Nelly, you touched on this, and there's a question also, well, Brendan, you touched on this as well, about engaging citizens in this discussion. And there's a question here from Simon Taylor again about how do we ensure citizens understand whether or not an asset might become stranded? And how do we support that discussion at the country level? And of course there's the role of the EITI's data and disclosures, and then of course the very important work that multi-stakeholder groups do in engaging governments and raising awareness and capacity at the country level. I wonder, Nelly and Dr. Syahrial, particularly from a country perspective, whether you have any sort of further insights or examples that you would like to bring in there to help sort of unpack and answer that question. Nelly, if I turn to you first.
Yeah. Thanks. I think disclosure is really important, and given why it's also important for citizens to be part of this discussion. And I think also with that multi-stakeholder approach that EITI provides, and getting different groups of people on one table to discuss that information is really important. I think beyond that, perhaps it also helps to put more information into the public domain, make the information more accessible for those that are not necessarily part of the NSGs, and also making the information really clear and looking to the future, because if you're talking about stranded assets and certain many of our, those that are not really privy to the EITI reports, the work plans and everything, and all that technical information may not be able to really perceive what the future holds when we're talking about the transition. So making it very clear, demystifying that information, as I'd mentioned earlier, and also really trying to make sure that across the board, even at the MSG level, that information everyone is privy to that information, because we find in many of our countries, even when we are talking about disclosure of contracts and agreements that have been signed, you'll find just at that table, half of that table knows what has been agreed on or what the risks are in certain cases. And the other half, in this case, I'm also talking about civil society, don't really know some of the risks and the challenges that we face in some of the agreements and stuff that has been signed on already and committed to. So I think when we're talking about citizens and information, it's really putting it out there into the public domain to make sure that it is fair and across the board, everyone knows what the risks are and what the future holds if certain, commitments are not adhered to in respect to the transition. But I think really to the point of it being fair and just, in the sense that, for those that feel that, the transition, they're ready for the transition, I think it's really fair that those that are not ready are given room to really understand what the implications are if they don't prepare for the transition. And that also really goes beyond national level, but really down to our communities and our grassroots. Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Nelly. And Dr. Syahrial, I want to give you the opportunity to come back in if you'd like to raise any examples from Indonesia. But Brendan, did you want to sort of comment on this in terms of stranded assets and civil society engagement on the topic?
Yeah, I think you have to be very careful about using the word stranded asset. The things we're talking about, hydrocarbon reserves, as usually talked about, they're not assets at all. And talking about them as stranded assets implies some form of legitimate expectation that these things will be used. And when you get into discussions about legitimate expectation, you have all sorts of commercial interests who will then use investor state discussions to then say, well, we need compensation. And we don't want to have a double whammy. We don't want the situation where a country felt that it had a right to development using something that cannot be developed and then is sued by a company because it can't develop that way. That would be the wrong way to go. So we have to distinguish very clearly between what are stranded assets, which are things which are in commercial development but which cannot be realized, and assets conventionally called, which aren't assets at all, things that you can never produce. I can think of some in the European context, for example, and all of those within the Arctic Circle. We would have to now think hard about whether they are assets anymore, because if there is no person who is going to buy them, and the European Commission has signaled that it's our view that we will never buy them, to what extent are they assets at all? And to what extent should they be allowed into the international financial system? So I really would be cautious about mixing the words stranded assets, and reserves and hydrocarbons. Maybe the first step in this discussion is to have a clear wording of what it is that we mean when we talk about these things.
Thanks, Brendan. It's really clear, and it's the question of whether we're talking about stranded assets or whether we're just acknowledging liabilities that are moving ahead anyway. There is another question, a very, very good question that's come in from Hazy Zagani, which I'm almost certainly not pronouncing correctly, apologies, about data timeliness and the pace of reporting. And this, of course, is a very important question when the science and the economics around the extractive sector are changing so rapidly. Is there an argument for accelerating the EITI reporting so that reports don't lose value, and also that so they can be relevant and of use and up to date for civil society? So Helen, maybe if we come back to you in just a moment on that, and I just want to check in also with Rohitesh and see if there were any sort of other comments with regard to the mining sector, because we've spoken a lot about fossil fuels, but any quick reflections from a mining perspective on these questions that have just come up. And then Helen, will loop back to you to close the panel.
Thank you. I'll be very quick, and I recognize that the issues for the mining sector are quite different to that for fossil fuels. Just because you and your colleagues do such great research, I might just make my comment perhaps an interesting research question to take on, building on something Helen said. Helen talks about countries perhaps not being able to realize the revenues they thought they might in this new world. The simplistic story around minerals is that we're going to need a lot more of them for the transition, so countries rich in those can expect a windfall of revenues and investment in their countries, and that will happen in many cases. But Siân, together with the energy transition, we will be moving to a circular economy too. And I wonder, wouldn't it be interesting to dig into how quick we move into a circular economy, and as a result, countries may even on minerals not get the full revenues they may be expecting, because we may be meeting a substantial portion of our future demand through a circular business model as opposed to a linear business model. I think that is a really interesting research question to dig into. So let me leave it there, and hopefully next year or sooner we'll have a chance to talk about that.
Ro, you'll be delighted to know that that's something we're already working on. So perhaps that's a topic for a webinar early next year. But yeah, let's carry on that discussion. In the meantime, if there are no other comments from our other panelists, we're 1 minute over. So thank you all for joining us. And Helen, I want to hand back to you for any quick remarks on that last question and your closing comments.
Yes, the quick remark on the last question is that the EITI is encouraging multi-stakeholder groups and countries to move away from long, slow retrospective reports and towards systematic disclosure of data from governments and companies, so that it just keeps coming, rather than people having to wait, as you say, for data that by the time it arrives is out of time. So there's been quite a big push, including from the Secretariat, to do that. But I think the session has been great in sort of flushing out how EITI can support member countries in evaluating the risks and opportunities presented by the energy transition, because while we're focused today on the assets, which, as Brendan says, aren't assets at all, the other side of the coin is the strategic minerals that really do become assets in this new environment. And where it's so important to get transparency, openness, good governance in place around those, so that citizens can realise the full benefits from their extraction. So thank you, Chatham House, for the partnership. Thank you to the panelists and discussants for contributing to the session.
Thank you, Helen, and the team at EITI. It's been a fantastic discussion, and panelists for joining us and being so generous with your time and your remarks. It's been a great discussion. We look forward to continuing it. Please, everyone, enjoy the rest of COP. Take a look through the wider programme and the other extractives-focused events today, tomorrow, and through next week. And we look forward to carrying on the discussion. Thank you.